Hello and welcome to the TID Water and Power Podcast. I'm your host, Constance Anderson, and on this month's episode, we're discussing land surveying. Next week is National Surveyors Week, an opportunity to highlight the important work surveyors do. While you may be able to spot surveyors and their equipment at an intersection or construction project, a lot of folks might not understand what exactly they do. At TID, the surveying department plays an especially important role in a variety of areas around the district. On this episode, I'm joined by TID Surveying and Right-of-Way Manager Tristan Higgins to discuss the areas the surveying team covers, the exciting projects the department is working on, and how the department has changed over the years. Tristan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start, if you would. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into surveying.
Well, I'll run right back to being about 4 years old. So my dad was a surveyor. Actually, my grandfather had worked in surveying. He wasn't a licensed surveyor, so I'm technically the third generation. So at about 4 years old, really started spending time with my dad. He'd be doing research at a local registry of deeds. So I would be down on the floor playing with matchbox cars and that kind of a thing while he did his research.
Very cool.
So that was really my beginning, getting that time to spend with him and, picking up what you can over the years. So then you fast forward, as I got a little bit older, I started working with him. I got private experience up home and then got into surveying as I got older. I actually went to college for 2 different degrees. I went for English and history.
Okay.
So just about as far away from surveying as you can get, I guess. Not much for mathematical background or anything like that. So, and a lot of that for me was because when I was in high school, I thought at that time I wasn't good at math.
Okay.
Which, if you know anything about surveying, it's a lot of math.
I would imagine.
But what I found out is that I wasn't good at math when it was abstract. Once you see what you can really do with it, kind of step into it. So specifically for TID, I started with TID 13 years ago. So in 2011, I was a survey tech 2 to start. So I came in with a little experience from the private side, a little bit from public as well. I became a senior survey tech 2 years afterwards. And then 9 months after that, I became the manager of the survey department. So I'd only been licensed for a few months at that point. Our previous manager moved on to another role. And so I was kind of thrust into the position, brand new licensee, and here you go, now run the department.
Wow. Nothing like jumping in with 2 feet.
Yeah.
Okay. So tell us about the actual makeup of the survey team at TID.
Sure. So despite the name, it's not just surveying. We have several different things that we work on. So we have 3 GIS technicians, 3 land surveying technicians, and then here and there through the year, during summertime, we'll have a couple of interns, 2 to 3 interns on at any given time, and those may be GIS interns, those might be land surveying interns, we've had several different kind of oddball interns as well, as far as people that will do historical research for us and that sort of a thing.
Not that the interns are oddballs, but that maybe the tasks assigned to them are a little odd.
Maybe it's both.
All right, that's fair.
And then during the wintertime, our WDOs aren't working on the canals as far as running water, obviously. So they're available to come over and help us on the survey side. And one of the reasons that's important, we get into this a little more detail later on maybe, but during the off season, there's a lot of irrigation specific work that needs to be done. So we bring them in to help us with that workload. Okay.
They kind of have a little bit of expertise in that area, so it complements the work that they would be doing with your team then.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay. And yes, we're going to dive more deeply into a lot of different things. But let's start kind of more high level, if you would. Can you kind of quickly describe each of the areas that you oversee, kind of the folks? You just gave us a breakdown of who makes up the team. What are the different areas that they work under?
Sure. So we have, I guess I'll start with land surveying. That's the one that's most familiar to people. And when you hear survey right-of-way department, you're thinking, okay, survey, what's that all about? So it's professional practice under California law. It would be Chapter 15 of the Business and Professions Code governs the practice of land surveying. Probably the biggest part of it that people are familiar with is the field survey side. So you'll see guys out there and you'll see what looks like a camera, right?
Sure.
People
Set up on a tripod.
Right.
Yeah.
People always come up to us and they say like, oh, can you take my picture? That sort of a thing. And usually what you're seeing there is one of two things. They're either doing topographic mapping, which basically just means denoting the coordinates, elevation of any fixed feature on the face of the earth or the earth itself, ground. Or they might be doing boundary mapping. So those are kind of the two main components that people are generally familiar with. Now, outside the district, you'll also get things like subdivision mapping where you're creating, we have one large lot and you need to create 50 housing lots. The district isn't involved in development mapping. I did some of that in my with previous employers, but that's also a big part of land surveying. So specifically for the district, we're really doing that topographic mapping. We're doing the boundary mapping, right-of-way determination, all that side of it. So then next up would be right-of-way. And the right-of-way side is it's real estate services. So on the survey side, we denote exactly where property boundaries are, and then creating things like easement documents and all that sort of thing. The right-of-way side is more actually going through the acquisition process. So what we're doing is talking to landowners, see if they're open to giving us an easement, negotiating the price, getting all of the signatures done, everything filed with the county, that side of it.
And that then clearly distinguishes this is TID property, this is private ownership property.
Right.
Got it. Okay.
Next up would be encroachment permits and the permitting process. And I think most people are familiar with that in the context of cities, counties, that kind of a thing. If you want to do something within the road right of way, you go down and you get an encroachment permit. Well, the district holds rights of ways as well. Easements and our rights are very similar to those that you see with a city or a county. So we have the same process in that if customers want to construct something or they want to drive up and down our canal banks to reach something on their property, they need an encroachment permit to do that. So we handle all of that process. Okay. And lastly is the newest addition to the survey department is GIS, so Geographic Information Systems. And this is something that's been done for several years here at the district, kind of a burgeoning technology in a way. But it's been done kind of all over the place. So you'd have some people in electrical that would be working on it, some people in irrigation that would be working on it in different departments. And only over the last year have we said we really need to bring this all in one place, and took basically all of the power users across those different departments and said, let's put them into one administration, move them all down to the survey area.
So it was taking place here at TID in a number of different departments, and recently those folks have kind of been consolidated into one sort of GIS think tank at TID.
Right.
Okay,
right.
Got it.
So if you're not familiar with GIS, and we'll go a little bit more into it later on, but it's really the creation of kind of generalized maps and then the ability to view and analyze data on a big scale. So really when you're trying to make general decisions, you need to know, depending on what you're trying to decide, you need to know all the parameters around that. And what we do with GIS is we put it into a geospatial context so you can actually see how things interact with each other or what components of this you may not have considered before.
Okay, very good. Well, hopefully that little preview has whet the appetite of our listeners, because now I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into each of those areas, if you will. So let's start with land surveying.
Sure. So I'm the sole licensed surveyor in our department. Now I'm actually only the second surveyor that the district's had. And what we used to have in the past is it was a civil engineer that was authorized to perform land surveying.
Oh, interesting.
And this is just a change in California law prior to 1982. So prior to 1982, if you were a civil engineer, you were a civil engineer and a land surveyor.
Okay.
In 1982, they split that and they said, no, you have to be have a separate land surveying license to perform land surveying. It started becoming more complicated. We started becoming more of a litigious society. So they said we need to split this off because it's just not the same discipline.
Got it. Okay.
So what that did was it created a regulatory requirement at that time that the district had a licensed surveyor to do land surveying work. And that business and professions code I talked about earlier, that governs both private and public agencies. So the district's governed by that same practice standard that a private firm would be.
Okay.
So talking a little bit about the actual work that we do within surveying. So land mapping and surveying is a big part of what we do. And that's kind of the precise mapping. So I talked a little bit about GIS and how that's general mapping. This is really the more precise mapping for facilities, planning purposes, engineering feasibility, engineering design, construction staking. And it basically starts at the beginning of the concept of a project. So if you have an idea that you're going to construct a new facility of any kind, you need to know the existing conditions, right? So you would go out there and you'd say, okay, I want the surveying department to give me a very detailed map that would show me any existing facilities, what the contour of the ground looks like, and then also establish what we call control, which is basically it's known points on the ground with assigned coordinates to them. So then we can come back out and tie everything to the same coordinate basis, if that makes sense.
Do your measuring against those specific points,
right?
Kind of know everything's on track.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
So we go through that whole process on any individual project that the district works on. And an example of that, I suppose, would be if we did a drop rehab project. So we have these irrigation drops that our listeners have heard about on previous podcasts. Some of those may be 80 years old, 100 years old. They're very old structures.
Sure.
If we're going to go in and modernize those, in a lot of cases, we're tearing out the entire drop and we're rebuilding it from scratch. You want all the elevations to match when you get done. You want to make sure that you're building on district property and you're not extending that out into property that you don't own. So we would go out there at the beginning and we'd say, here's the existing conditions. Here's where all the boundary lines are. And we give all of that information to the engineering department. Now they're designing on kind of real world information.
Sure.
Then on the back end, they get done with design and they say, we need to tell construction maintenance how to construct this. It's our job to take that design and put it on the ground so there's something for construction maintenance actually to see.
Okay. Interesting.
This is something that you see a lot of agencies do. You'll see, as you're driving down the road, a new roadway project, and you'll see all these stakes on the side of the road. Surveyors put that out there. One of the things that we've looked into over the years, and we've talked to other agencies about how much of this do we do in-house, how much of it do we contract out. And there's some local agencies here that have actually gone through the process recently just because they couldn't get survey staff on. They said, let's contract it. And what they found is it's a lot more cost effective to have in-house people because they can mobilize at a moment's notice. They know the inner workings of all of your facilities. They know what you want the end result to look like for the engineers that you have. So we've just found that to be much more cost effective and efficient.
Absolutely. Yeah. Everybody's working on the same team. So you gave us an example of what land mapping and surveying might look like on the irrigation side. Can you give us an example of how that might be used on the electrical side?
Sure. So I'd say the most common one is probably a new service line. We have a customer that'll put in a request and they'll say, I just want to run a new service line to this property that I have. Obviously, we need to know when we construct that line that it's on their property and not on their neighbor's property. And
good point.
You'd be very surprised how often we get out there when you talk to the landowner and they say, yep, here's the driveway that separates me from my neighbor. And we find out, no, that driveway is actually 80 feet farther onto the neighbor's property than what we really thought.
Wow.
That doesn't necessarily mean it's the end of the project or anything like that. What we determine then is we have to get an easement document. If you want to build it here on the neighbor's property, we need to get an easement giving us the right to do that from the neighbor.
Sure.
So sometimes, customers might look at that and they might say, hey, this slowed my project down, but we're protecting the neighbor just as much as we are the customer.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's one of the things about having a licensed land surveyor on staff is, although I work for the district, my responsibility as a licensed professional isn't the district specifically. I have an equal responsibility to all the landowners, and I have to act in their best interest.
Very cool. So what would you say is the split of the work that you do for either the irrigation side or the electrical side at TID?
So I would say it's actually about 60-40 towards electrical.
Oh, okay. So more on the electrical side.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Historically, if you start going back into the 70s and before, really surveying did the majority of work for irrigation side. It was heavily irrigation based. In the 70s and through the 80s, we started picking up more electrical work. And really that was when we brought one engineering department all together. It was kind of a process of now we have a combined engineering department.
As opposed to having one more on the water side and one on the electric side.
Right.
Okay.
So that lasted for quite a while. And then it later was actually split back just as the work got more complicated again and more specialized. That all split back out. But at that time, we were already doing all of this work for electrical. And they said, well, we have one survey department. We don't want to hire an electrical surveying department just to do our work. So over time, it's become about a 60-40 split or so. And a lot of that is there's just many more electrical customer requests that we get rather than people wanting to run new pipelines or canal rehab projects.
That makes sense. And with only 2 actual surveyors ever being employed by TID, it doesn't sound like they're a dime a dozen. Are they difficult to come by?
Yeah. So in the state of California, I haven't looked at the number recently, but state of California, you have about 4,500 civil engineers total, and you have about 10% of that number, 400 or so land surveyors.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So when you start thinking about all of the agencies, and any agency that wants to do land surveying, they have to have a land surveyor. Any private company that wants to do land surveying, they have to have a land surveyor.
Sure.
That 400, it becomes difficult to find.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we have any students out there that are considering potential career options, maybe think about land surveying.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a bad idea.
Okay. All right. So you've mentioned mapping a few times, but can we talk a little bit more about what actually does that mean? What is that?
Sure. So it isn't just a generalized map. It's a very detailed map in both an electronic and physical format. And the majority of our work now is done using that electronic format. You're doing everything on computers. People really aren't drawing things out on a physical map anymore. We do create a physical map, but that's really just for our record keeping and our requirement to have that stamped and signed by a licensed surveyor and so on.
Got it.
But really, it's an extremely accurate product that contains an accuracy statement. So what I'm doing is I'm going through and I'm certifying on that map all of these positions are accurate to within whatever the requirement for the project is, and that may be as tight as something like a quarter or an eighth of an inch.
Oh wow!
And then kind of the upper end of what we usually get into would be we call them tenths. We have this strange system, and maybe I'll spend a minute talking about it. For surveyors, we use feet.
Okay.
But we don't use inches. We use tenths of feet and hundredths of feet.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
The math is
now you're
easier.
going back to this whole math thing.
Yeah. Right. So we use that kind of hybrid between a metric system and an imperial system, and we really just do that for ease of calculation. So at any point here, if I start running off and I say a tenth,
okay,
it's a tenth of a foot is what I'm talking about.
A tenth of a foot. Okay. Okay. That's probably a helpful explanation as we go forward.
So that accuracy statement as we get to it, what I'll do on the back end is I basically run a statistical analysis, and I'm saying, here was the equipment I used, here was the methods that we used on this project, here is the requirements for the project. So now let's look at all of these individual observations and redundant observations, and did we meet that accuracy threshold based on the results that I'm getting? So you actually have to calculate all of that out. You use your statistics that you learned in college, and you say, okay, here's my result, and I'm comfortable giving this horizontal accuracy of X and a vertical accuracy of Y. And you put that on the face of the map. Then what I do is I stamp it, which has, it's basically just a little round stamp that has my name and number on it. It says that you're licensed under this license number. And I sign it. Once I do that, there's liability involved in me doing that.
Okay. And so that is then a legally binding document.
Right. Yeah. As they're all district documents, it's binding on the district as far as, hey, the district did this work, here's how accurate it is. And then it's also binding on me as the professional in charge of it, where I'm saying this is how I did this work and this is what I'm certifying.
Yeah. So what kind of pressure does that put on you? I mean, every time you go to stamp and sign one of these things, you have to feel pretty good about it.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to be very, very confident in it. And that's really one of the reasons that surveying is a professional practice that you have to be licensed for. It's not for us to feel good about ourselves or anything like that. It's to protect the public.
Sure.
Because it requires us to practice in a certain fashion so that everything that we do is accurate. And if it's not, we're subject to the board, not the TID board, but the licensing board in Sacramento saying, you aren't doing this the way that you're supposed to, and now there's repercussions.
Wow. Okay. So no pressure or anything. So let's go back to that example you gave of the drop structure when we're redoing one of those. What does mapping look like for something like that?
That product, when we get it back, it's going to have horizontal coordinates for basically every little angle point on that drop. It's not just a matter of saying, here's a gate on the drop. It's actually all the little permutations of that gate. So any horizontal deflections, any vertical changes, all the elevations of various components of that gate are all shown on there. So what you end up with is a map that is extremely detailed. And you imagine if you have a concrete structure like a drop that was poured, it can't be poured perfectly. It's just impossible for the crews to go out there and say, yes, this is 100% accurate vertically, and that's how we poured it. So when you're designing a new gate that has to fit into an existing structure, you need to know exactly how all of those components relate to each other. So as we create that, we're going to get a map back on the back side that shows all those angle points of every component of that structure. And for a drop, I'm going to throw a number out here. I think typical drop, you're looking at maybe 5,000 to 6,000 points. So
wow.
Actual positions that are being observed in the field, all having to meet that accuracy standard. And then we basically come back in the other end in the office, and it's almost like the connect the dots that you used to do when you were a kid.
Sure.
So you end up with 6,000 points, and then you have to connect the dots and draw all the lines between all of those for it to make sense to anybody except a surveyor.
Oh my goodness.
So when we actually go out and we collect those points, and if you ever go out and you watch us, you may see a guy standing there, and they may have basically a prism on a stick, right?
Okay.
And that's actually how they're measuring the location. What they're also doing is they're saying, this is what I'm measuring. So they may say, I'm measuring an angle point in a concrete slab. And there will be a code that goes along with that. So they're actually typing into equipment and saying, this is an angle point in a concrete slab, and from here, the concrete slab runs southeast and southwest. And that's just basically something that tells us when we get back in the office, here's how you connect this dot to everything else that's around it.
Got it. It's positioning relative to what it's positioned in.
Right.
Okay. My goodness. That sounds like no connect the dot that I would ever want to partake in.
We have tons of it to do if you want to come over and give it a try.
Oh, I don't. You would definitely not sign off on my mapping. I feel very confident in that. Okay, so then on the electrical side of things, how does the mapping look for that? There are less concrete points to deal with, but what are some of the considerations there?
For most electrical projects, you're right. It isn't as detailed in as small of an area. I'd say aside from substations and plant engineering, usually it's a little more of a simple process as far as the actual topographic map goes. Okay. But on the electrical side, we actually spend a lot more time on the boundary side of things. So you imagine a pole line that may be, a simple extension that might run for a half mile or so. You have a lot of different properties along the way. We have to denote all of the boundary lines of those properties, how they interact with road right-of-way on the front, make sure that all our facilities are constructed within those existing rights-of-way or acquire new rights-of-way in some cases. The other thing that we have to do is take a look at span lengths. So it's not just a matter of telling our line department, we've lined up all these poles so it's a straight line.
Mm-hmm.
We also have to make sure that all of those individual spans between the poles are to design, mostly equal. And then we look at things like deflection angles. And what that means is you have a pole line that runs down, running basically along one trajectory. If you have to put an angle into it for any reason, there's only a certain amount of angle you can put in before you have to put guy lines and make changes to the facility. So we're basically doing the mapping that contains all of that, submitting it back to engineering and saying, okay, guys, take a look at this and make sure everything looks good and you're willing to sign off on it. If they do, then that goes over to line department and they do the construction.
Okay. And what if they have questions or they have concerns about the way things are aligned? They kick it back to you guys and you take another look?
Yeah, usually what goes on is they say, well, let's meet out in the field. This looks a little too extreme. Let's meet in the field and work this out. And between us and the estimators upstairs, we work it out basically all at one time in the field.
Got it.
And that's really just an efficiency thing. Rather than go back and forth, we just say, let's just get out there and run through this all at once.
Totally makes sense. So how much of this mapping, or maybe how often is the way to ask the question, is this done?
So I did take a look at the last few years to kind of see what we had on the survey side. And we do about 150 survey projects per year. They're mostly driven by customer requests for pole lines and canal improvement projects. That's the vast majority of them.
Oh, interesting. So not necessarily TID-initiated capital projects, but requests from customers. What is the split on that?
I'd say as far as workload goes, it's about a 50-50. If you look at the raw numbers, it's mostly customer projects, but those tend to be a little more simple. So just number of hours spent, work hours is about 50-50 customer to internal. Now, one thing to think about there, though, is that one project isn't equivalent to every other project. So a customer pole line might be as simple as, hey, I need 2 poles set. I just want to make sure they're on my property, not on my neighbor's. We might be able to get that done in a day, depending on what's going on. It's pretty quick.
Okay.
That's project 1 in our list. Project 2 in our list may be a major canal project that we're going to spend a week and a half on because there's a lot of stuff that's going on in that area. So when we talk about our project load, as far as being 150 projects, it might be an afternoon or it might be 2 weeks.
Sure, absolutely. That's still a good number of projects. Okay, so tell us a little bit about kind of what this looks like. You know that you need to do this mapping project. Is that an all hands on deck? Is that one guy going out to kind of take these measurements? How does that work?
So it does depend on the project. I would say the majority of projects we're sending out 2-person crews. And the reason that we do that is because so many of our projects, they're in the road. We're out in road right of way. You never want to have one person out there by themselves when you're dealing with traffic and all that sort of thing. So it's largely for the safety standpoint. There's also efficiency in having 2 people there. So it's not just the safety component, but that is a large part of it.
So if you've got typically 2 people going out at one time, and you mentioned that there are 3 technicians on the team, that's a substantive portion of your group.
Right. Yeah, and certain projects actually require more than that. So you might have to send 3 people out and then sometimes even beyond that. So what we do there is during the non-irrigation season, we bring in WDOs, water distribution operators. They help us during the non-irrigation season. One of the reasons that that's so important for us to have them during that time is we only have so many months to get all of the irrigation projects done. When water's out of the canal is really the only time you can make those measurements in the bottom of the canal.
Sure.
Unless you really want to, try your swimming. So we only have so many months to get all of that done. We bring the WDOs in and basically just hit all of those projects, usually between November and March, aside from those months that we're either getting completely rained out or there's stormwater running, whatever that looks like.
Right. A very limited window to get in there. So you mentioned earlier that right-of-way has to do with real estate services, with easement acquisition. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the biggest part really is that real estate services side where we're doing land acquisition, might be just outright buying a piece of property for a new substation or a regulating reservoir or something like that, where we are acquiring a bigger piece of land, all the way down to individual easements, for something simple like a couple of poles going in or something along those lines. So it's really the acquisition of either property or property rights, as well as the disposition of those rights. So if we get to the point that we constructed a facility back in 1950, the facility is no longer necessary, the district isn't just going to hang on to that easement just because we want to hold it. We're going to quit claim that back to the landowner. So in a lot of cases, if we're removing the facility, we'll do that at the time of removing it. If something out there has changed, it's just not necessary anymore, usually the landowners come to us and they actually request the quit claim at that point.
Got it. Okay. Interesting. So now we've kind of used, I feel like, right-of-way and easement a little bit interchangeably. How would you specifically define easement?
So an easement is just holding a property right in the land of another individual. So a lot of the time when we talk about land acquisition on our side, we talk about fee title. And fee title basically just means I own it outright. I own all of the rights associated with this. It's my property that I own.
Okay. An
easement right is a limited right. So in that easement document, it's going to say, here's exactly the rights that you hold. And those might be, for our side, on an electrical facility side, it would be you have the right to access, you have the right to construct an electrical facility, you can maintain it, you can change out transformers and conductors, you can clear vegetation, all those sort of things. And it's a multi-page document that has a lot of different kind of legal language in there to allow us to do all of that. But it is that limited right. So that's all we hold. So an example of that would be if I come to you and I say, we need to acquire an electrical easement, I build an electrical line. In 20 years, somebody from the district can't come back and say, now we're constructing an irrigation line right next to it, and there's nothing you can do about it because it's our property. That's not how that works. We've acquired it for electrical purposes only.
And there are different levels of what that right-of-way might look like.
Right. So the actual right-of-way document or the actual easement document spells out exactly this is for these purposes, and it kind of limits the authority that you're granting. If you're a landowner and you say, I'm going to grant a right-of-way or I'm going to grant an easement to the district, you're going to want to know this is exactly what I'm giving to you. No more. This is
got it.
This is what we're negotiating over.
So similarly, then TID owns the property around our canals and our canal banks. A grower might have an easement onto TID property to drive his tractor for harvest, but that doesn't necessarily mean he has the right to plant crops in that easement, or because there are the varying levels of what's allowed there.
Yeah, that would be an application of it. Now, we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute as far as encroachment permits go, but how the district handles those requests is through an encroachment permit process.
Okay. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Okay, so before we get into encroachment permitting then, what are some potential issues that might arise when we can't access our facilities via the easements that have been established?
Right, so we need to access our facilities to maintain them, improve them, that sort of thing. And I guess a good example of it is along canal banks. So the canal banks serve two purposes for us. One is to access, obviously. The other one is it's actually a structural component of the canal. People don't always think about that, but it is supporting the lining of the canal. If we can't access it because, say, a landowner planted crops there or constructed a block wall or something along those lines, not only does it cause us issues on the maintenance and access side, but our engineering department might look at that and say, this is actually causing a structural issue depending on what the nature of the encroachment is. So then we have to come through and remove all of those encroaching facilities or the crops, whatever it is. A landowner that's done that, they're usually not very happy when they've just spent however much money maintaining and fertilizing and watering those.
Sure.
So usually what we say is whenever you're going to redevelop or you're going to make any changes and anywhere near a district facility, give us a call. Because then we can look into the records that we have, kind of talk you through, here's what all of that looks like. We can even come out and kind of meet with you on site. And what that does is you may be able to make changes to that facility to alleviate any future concerns.
Got it.
So kind of a good rule of thumb that we always tell people to follow is if you're out there on a canal bank and you measure 22 feet from the top of lining, that's usually about where we try and keep the edge of our easement. That's our standard easement width. So what that does is it represents a good standard distance that gives us the access room that we need, as well as that structural component of the canal bank.
Okay. But again, every location kind of has its own
Every location
nuance.
is a little different.
Yeah.
We have some areas that our rights of way are significantly wider than those canal banks. There's a few around the district where it's to the magnitude of 100 feet beyond the canal bank.
Okay.
Now, in those cases, there's reasons for that. There's pipelines that are underground in those locations and that sort of a thing. But it's just important to understand that before you start a construction project.
Sure. So when in question, reach out to the district.
Right.
Okay. Very good. Okay. So now let's go back to encroachment permitting. So what does it actually mean to encroach on someone's property or TID property? And is there a way to get approval for that encroachment?
Right. So as I mentioned, we have these easement rights. We have fee property that we own all around the district, different areas. That doesn't mean that we just tell everybody, hey, you can't do anything in here at all. Although the district has the right to restrict those uses, we want the property next to us to kind of have the maximum beneficial use. So that might be something where we say, yeah, we have a pipeline in this area and this is how much space we need for access and maintenance. But say a landowner says, well, I want to build a pool and it's not going to impact your use. Here's my proposal to build that pool. We'll look at that and we could say, okay, we can allow that in this location, but we want to give you an encroachment permit. The reason we do that, there's a couple of reasons that we do it. One is so the district knows exactly what's going on. We make sure everything's built to standard. We protect our facility, that kind of a thing. The other one is then the landowner doesn't spend a large amount of money building something and not have any paperwork that says they were allowed to do it in the first place.
Right.
So this is a process that we've changed a lot over the last few years. We've kind of modernized it. We've run it through our legal department to make sure that everything is providing that protection for both parties. And so now we have a pretty robust process where anything that you're going to construct, we can provide you with the standards for how those need to be built, and then provide you at the end of it, here's the signed document that says, yeah, you're allowed to do it. It can basically remain for as long as it needs to remain. One thing that's important to note, though, is an encroachment permit isn't quite the same as an easement right in that it is something that over time, our operational needs may change, so there's potential that something would have to get removed. We try and do everything on the front end so that can not happen.
Okay.
But we always have to maintain that thought of if something just bizarre happens, we may need to go in there and either modify that document or ask you to remove those facilities.
Okay. And assuming nothing of that drastic nature changes, what is the lifespan of either an easement or an encroachment permit?
So an easement, unless it specifies otherwise, is perpetual. It basically lasts forever. And it also lasts through property changes. So if you sell your property, that easement is part of the record. It just maintains forever.
Okay, good to know.
Encroachment permit's similar as far as unless it specifies, it could last forever. Now, we put in there language that says if something changes, it may need to be modified or revoked, all that sort of thing. But one of the reasons we do the encroachment permit process is because then it does carry on to subsequent landowners. So if you buy a piece of property that has a pool in the backyard, I'm not going to come to you 3 months after you just bought it and said, well, that agreement was with the last landowner.
Right.
we want this pool out of here.
That would be a bad situation.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so then let's move on to then kind of the final deep dive area, GIS, or Geographic Information Systems.
So this is the newest part of our department. And when we went through the process of kind of bringing everybody into one place, one of the reasons behind that is because there's components of GIS that fall under land surveying. So in general, GIS, almost everybody listening to this has had some experience with GIS. So it's things like Google Maps, Yelp, Waze, all of those things where you say, okay, I see an aerial image here, and then I can see that there's businesses and, actual roadways and all these different things that I can see on there. That's a very rudimentary version.
Okay, got it.
But that essentially is GIS. It's showing you the spatial relationship between all these different things and then giving you what we call attribute data. So it's additional information about those businesses, the name of the business, phone number, operating hours, all that kind of a thing.
Okay.
So what we use GIS for here at the district is for general planning and our facility mapping. So we want internally to see where all of our electrical lines are, where all of our irrigation lines are, any property we own, basically any data that we have that could have a geospatial component, a location on the ground. We want to tie that into the GIS. What that does for us is it makes it all quickly available for our staff. It also lets us do things like now we can start to see spatial relationships between all of these different things that you may not have thought about before.
Okay. Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. So if you had something along the lines of, I'm going to construct a pole line, historically, you might have a mapping product that just shows where all these pole lines are.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't be able to see there's an irrigation line running there. Even as far as other agencies have GIS data as well. So you might say, well, there's a PG&E gas line running in that vicinity. Here's the owners of the property and where the property lines are, approximately.
Okay, got it.
So as you start looking at these things, you can really start to get a better idea of how everything relates to each other. And then you get one step beyond that where you can look at things like maybe you need to know what the soil type is in an area. Well, there's data sets out there that will actually tell you in general, this is what the soil type that you're likely to encounter in this specific area.
Huh, okay, interesting. Okay, so then the operators at TID can see these locations. They're seeing kind of this, as you said, contextual information. And then what do they do with that? How do they use that information?
So on the design side, it's really just providing them kind of the generalized information to make planning decisions. So if you're going to do an improvement, now you might be able to identify the ideal locations for those improvements a little more easily, being able to see everything all in one spot. Now on the operations side, you can take a look at things like modeling the system. And that's something that we're working on right now, where we can actually model out kind of operational changes within, say, a pipeline or an electrical line. So you can look at things like if a specific transformer is taken out of service for whatever reason, these are the kind of downstream customers that will be affected by that. So it helps you from a notification standpoint. It helps you from an outage management standpoint. And then again, on the irrigation side, you can start to look at kind of modeling the actual flow of water within all of those facilities. So from a planning perspective and just information availability perspective, it really is a huge efficiency gain. No longer are you having to go digging through all these paper documents and kind of assemble everything and try and put it all together. It's just there in front of you. Okay,
interesting. Yeah, and that kind of brings everything together because we've talked about, the use of some of these different features of land surveying and whatnot to kind of map what these new facilities might look like or the upgrades to the facilities might look like. But now you're talking about a whole different type of information when you're talking about the modeling of the way water is moving through that facility.
Yeah. And you can even go beyond that where you say, I want to know all of, again, that attribute data about each individual feature. So if you want to know when was this pole constructed, what facilities are installed on that pole, do we have an agreement for the communication company to use that pole? All of that can be tied to it. You can pull all of that up right then from your computer. So when you start thinking about, here at the district, we're always talking about we're trying to do more and more with our existing resources.
Sure.
This really enables a lot of that.
Very cool. Okay. Other innovative uses that in that way that we're using GIS for?
So one of them that people are very familiar with as far as roads go, just about everybody has gotten onto Google Earth and they've used Street View.
Sure.
We're doing the same thing down our canal banks. So we basically have purchased a 360-degree camera, mounted it on top of a vehicle, and then during the off-season, we're having one of those WDOs I talked about earlier. They drive up and down the canal banks, and they're taking photos as they go. With 250 miles of canal times 2, because you're hitting both banks.
Yeah.
It's an awful lot of territory to cover, but we're able to do that over the course of about 2 to 3 weeks.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So they move pretty quickly, and then it's just a matter of getting all of that back in and then actually doing the coding on the other end to get those photos to come in the correct location and all of that. But at the end of all of it, it basically allows people in the office to get a look at what did this look like when water was out of the canal and kind of get an idea of the conditions that exist out there. And that helps them do their design work largely.
Sure.
So when you're talking about an engineer, they have the very detailed map from survey and they can see all of that. But sometimes a picture helps an awful lot.
Absolutely. Well, and I imagine that would also come into play if, let's say, a WDO or a grower reports that they think there's a canal leak at this location. Now you can actually go to that location and have that kind of visual information and all of the collective information that goes with it to kind of assess what's happening there, where this leak is and how you might go about mitigating that.
Right, and that kind of jumps into one of our other areas that we've started doing, which is actual issue reporting for our field staff. So when they're out on the canal bank, they always have their phones with them.
Sure.
And we've rolled out this app for them where they can basically at a few button presses, they can say, I saw this particular issue, and it might be the canal bank is blocked, or it might be this gate is damaged. Anything that they might encounter, they can report that. This has always been a process that the district's followed, but in the past, it hasn't been electronic. They would fill out an issue reporting sheet, and bring that back into the office.
The old pencil and paper method.
Right.
Okay.
And on that sheet, they would describe, here's what I saw, here's the location, and that might be I was 500 feet west of this particular road. And then they send that in, and in, usually a couple of days, that would run through and be sent over to construction maintenance. If our staff went out there to further investigate it, you might find out they weren't 500 feet east of that road. They thought it was a different road. So now you can't find it.
Got it. Okay.
There's some inefficiencies there. Okay. And then there's that several days. Who knows what has gone on over the last two days. So what we're doing now is we built it all into an app. So you're still doing that reporting. You're saying, here is my location. Now it's taking latitude, longitude, a GPS location of where you were. You're taking photos of exactly what you saw when you were there. That gets turned into an issue report that within about 2-3 minutes is construction maintenance. So that allows them to respond very quickly. It also provides a lot of metrics for us. So we can see if you have one particular section of canal that has a lot of these leak issues, maybe that's a section of canal that we need to spend some time on during the off season and do some work out there.
Okay, good point. Yeah. If it's something that's kind of coming up again and again, it could be pointing to a larger issue.
Right.
And now you have record of exactly where these issues are happening.
Right.
Got it. Okay. Very cool. All right. So how has the surveying department evolved at TID since you've become involved with it?
So when I first started, I'd say we were kind of on the cusp of doing things the modern way. We were really moving in that direction.
Okay.
And one of the biggest things that we've seen there is it's kind of transitioning from having a handshake over, I'm going to build this on your property. Let's just agree.
Everybody's okay with it.
Everyone's okay with it, and on we go. I think in a lot of cases that could still work. But when you start getting into the property now has sold to a developer and they want to do something pretty major with it, that handshake agreement, it doesn't stand up in a court by any means.
Sure, absolutely.
So now we've really, particularly on the electrical side, we've really pushed for, let's get these easement documents formalized. It not only, like I mentioned before, it not only protects the district, but it protects the customer. They know exactly what's involved here.
Absolutely. I would imagine that the changes and the improvements that you've seen on the technology side have helped in that process in making things more formalized.
Yeah, it's really helped us on the efficiency side in a lot of cases. Technology has changed an awful lot, I would say, in the last 15 years or so. And the district went from using really more of a manual process to modern equipment. So we were right when I started, we were just getting into using GPS for all of our location. That was a big game changer as far as the amount of time that it takes on an individual project. And that's allowed us basically to keep the same staffing levels that we've always had when we went from, maybe 60 projects a year now to 150 projects a year.
But they're moving more efficiently, so you can take those on. Got it. Okay, so let's talk about kind of some of the key projects that the department is working on, starting maybe on the GIS side.
Sure. So as I mentioned, we brought everybody together about a year ago. What that has looked like for the last year is really just getting all of those processes to be the same across both sides of the house. Whenever you combine departments, you're going to look at it and say, okay, we really have to get everybody doing everything in a standardized
rowing
fashion.
In the same direction, right.
So we are to the point now that we're really starting to roll out some new projects, both internal and external projects. Okay. On the external side, the biggest one that we've done just this winter, and it was the first winter we've done it, but it's providing an outage map on our website. So whenever there's an outage on a canal, you can see that on our website, and you can say, okay, I see that this canal is out, and it's out from this date to this date. And it's all very easy to follow. And the reason that's important is because we have customers that may want to use a canal to move winter water. There's all kinds of different reasons. And it may be as simple as well as just, I see that there's a bunch of construction equipment out here. I wonder what TID's doing. You can actually see, okay, I see kind of what they're doing out there. You get a little bit more information behind it. So this year what we did was we created a PDF version of it. What we want to do in the future is create an electronic version of it. So again, kind of like Google Earth, you can jump in there and you can see more information than just this canal is out from these dates to this date. You can get some more information about here's the project that we're working on, all that sort of thing. And it's a kind of an outreach thing. I think people like to know, here's what the district's working on, here's how long it's going to take, all that sort of thing. And then hopefully that'll kind of stave off. People don't have to then call us, take their own time to call us and say, hey, what is this I'm seeing across the road from my house? Yeah,
exactly. Okay, cool. And then what about on the internal mapping side?
So internal side, we're really focusing right now on data aggregating. So an organization like the district, you have all sorts of different departments, and they all know where their own information is.
Okay.
So the more you can take that information and get it in one centralized location so that everybody can see it, the more efficient you are. Now your staff isn't having to spend time, basically, let's get a bunch of information packaged together to send over to this other department. You're able just to focus on the work that you need to do. They can pull it for themselves. The other thing is people don't always know what information other departments have. So you might move forward on a project and just not realize, well, there was pertinent information that this other department had that could have saved you time. Well, now if we get it all in one place, you can run through that and very quickly pull that information out. So that's been a big focus for us. It's the district's been around a long time. There's just a huge amount of documents, huge amount of information.
Absolutely.
So I'm pretty certain I'm going to be doing it all the way through my career, but we'll keep working on it.
Awesome. Well, and that is kind of one of those things that never ends, right? There's always new information to be added and new data to aggregate, I suppose. Okay. What about the historical boundaries of the district itself? Have you given any time to kind of assessing those?
So this is a good tie between GIS and land surveying as far as the legal boundary of the district is a question of land surveying specifically.
Okay.
So there's a very long legal document, and if any listeners ever want to see it, give me a call. I can show you a copy of it. But essentially, you're running through pages and pages and pages of legalese that defines exactly where the district boundary is. So we were redoing the division maps through the district for election purposes. And we said, well, we need to be absolutely certain of exactly where this boundary is, as close as you can possibly get it. So we went through and reworked that whole thing. And really, we were pretty impressed with how the kind of old version of it was done. But now that we have a more accurate one, it just gives us, a little more comfort in moving forward. And it's really not a changing document. That's something that is going to be here forever.
And how closely would you say the old boundary lined up with the more confirmed boundary? Were we pretty close?
Well, for a surveyor, no. But I think in general, for what they were trying to accomplish, I think they did a pretty good job of it at the time. There were areas that it was drawn on the wrong side of the road and that kind of a thing. So you might see a shift of 80 feet, something along those lines. But even then, we're treating this as it is a general overview document. It's not really intended for you to go out and say, this tree is on the west side of the boundary or the east side of the boundary. When we start getting that accurate, that's when we say we need to send the survey crew out and really put it on the ground.
Makes sense. Okay. So what, if any, of this information is available to the public? You mentioned that for the first time this year, we've had the canal outage map. That was public facing. But what other of this data might the public be able to access?
So at this moment, we haven't rolled out anything for the public aside from that outage map. But over this next year, one of the things that we want to do is start putting out some versions of irrigation pipeline mapping and that kind of a thing. And really the goal behind that, we recognize people may buy new properties, they may move into the area. They don't know who their WDO is. They don't know what the name of that pipeline is. They may not even know that pipeline's there. So if we can roll all that out for the customers to be able to see for themselves, it just means when they call customer service, they don't have to call in as the person that's saying, here's my address, but I don't know anything of what I'm trying to ask you.
Sure.
So again, it saves them some time that they can call in and say, this is the pipeline I'm interested in. Here's this WDO service area I'm in, and they just have all that information at their fingertips.
Very cool. And you said hoping to roll that out over the next year or so?
Yes.
Very cool. Okay. So you've talked a lot about this data that we're accumulating and that your team is working on aggregating, and we know that data is just numbers until you do something with it. So what are some of the innovative ways that you guys are displaying this data?
So aside from just having maps available where you can view all of it, we're also creating dashboards. And so that may be, we're just displaying numerical data in pie charts and graphs and all of that. And really that's focused around decision makers here at the district. So in a lot of cases, they're not getting down into the details of individual design. They just want to know raw numbers. And that may be something, along the lines of, I mentioned before, that issue reporting. They may not be as concerned with the exact locations of those issues. They want to know things like, well, how many blocked canal banks did we have over the last year? How long did it take the district to respond to each of those? That kind of a thing. So we're displaying all of this data on the back end in these dashboards, which are just very quick. They're easy to be pulled up by those decision makers, and then they can see metrics of kind of what's going on at a glance around the district. It's very rudimentary at this point because, again, we've just kind of gotten started in this process. But eventually we see this being a big driver for those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's great. Can you give us an example of application of how these dashboards are being used?
Sure. So one of them that we have available is for our construction maintenance manager. He's able to see all of these issue reports that I've talked about a couple of times. So he'll be able to tell how many of those reports we have, who reported them, what service areas they're located in, all of that. So I'll maybe jump back for a minute here and talk a little bit about that reporting process. I mentioned earlier it's an app on the phone for our WDOs out in the field. They're reporting all of these issues based on the type of issue that they see. So it might be a pipeline leak, broken vent, trash on the canal bank, whatever that looks like. And again, that includes the location, any additional information, photos of what they saw. When CNM gets that report within just a couple of minutes, they can then triage it.
And CNM is?
Construction maintenance.
Okay, got it.
So when construction maintenance gets that report, they can do the triaging of it. that is sent to the specific crew that's going to work on it. Now, our construction maintenance manager in the dashboard, he can see where all of the locations of these reports are, when they were reported, and then he can basically decide, okay, I have a crew, I know they're up here working on this individual intersection. I'm going to send them down to do this because they're the closest to that report. He then can send that to them as an assignment, and they get an assignment. You now have this new job to do, and it's 2.1 miles away. Here's your turn-by-turn directions to get there.
Wow, cool.
So really, it makes the data more digestible for staff, and it also makes it available for more people. And what I mean by that is when these reports come in, it basically does an email blast through a whole bunch of different people here at the district. And it's, here is a report that was made, here's the location. And the reason that's important is it breaks down kind of these information silos that are built over time.
Sure.
Because now you actually know what's going on. It's not just a report that's between the water distribution operator and construction maintenance. It's a report that you can dive into and go, hey, I know something about this location. Maybe there's something that's helpful.
Right, absolutely. And again, as you mentioned earlier, it's improving the efficiency of how we do work, because now that crew isn't coming back to headquarters to get their next assignment to go right back to where they were within 2.1 miles of where they were before.
Right.
Okay, very good. All right, tell us about another project you're working on.
So one that we're really excited about is a pilot project between us and a company called Land IQ. And it's a good-sized project. It's changing a lot from a data availability standpoint. And so right now we're 1 year into a 3-year pilot. How it works is twice a year, Land IQ flies satellites to capture imagery. What that imagery does for us is it actually gives us crop types through the entire district. So in the past, what would go on is we would just talk to landowners. What are you planning to plant this year? If they had a permanent crop, we know it's probably going to be almonds because they're not going to tear out a 5-year-old orchard, that kind of a thing. But it was really just up to the WDOs to have the conversations with customers, realize that a change has happened, and then put that into our system. So not always particularly accurate. The acreage would be way off because it's just everybody's best estimate of kind of what's going on in the area. Sure.
And especially on property that changes over what is grown there multiple times a year, or maybe they decide to skip a season.
Right. So what you get now is twice a year we're actually recording what crops are out there. And they do that they're basically taking near infrared images. And then they can compare those returns to, this is what an almond looks like under these conditions. So it's identifying crops on a field-by-field basis. What that does for us is it really lets us gauge demand. You also get information out of it as far as, well, how old are these individual crops approximately? So that lets us start looking at things like, well, if they're going to redevelop this orchard in the next 5 years, maybe we need to reach out to them and tell them, you've got a pipeline running right through the middle of your property. Let's talk about your spacing of the crops so we can, mitigate any issues.
Sure.
So the other thing we're getting out of Land IQ is there's weather stations that have been installed around the district. And those weather stations give us precipitation data in much more granular format than what we've ever had before. So previously we had one station that we were basically saying, this is the rainfall that the district service area received. And it's located near Denair. People from the area will know your rainfall in Denair is not going to be the same over at the San Joaquin River. It's not going to be the same up north in Hickman or down in Delhi. So now we have 12 stations, and we're actually looking to densify that again to get more local precipitation. And again, that's really from a kind of demand modeling perspective. Now we can get a better idea of who got a lot of rain at a particular time, who didn't. And then again, that just lets our decision makers and our board make more informed decisions regarding things like, when are we going to bring water in at the beginning of the season?
That makes a lot of sense. Now, so TID is working with this Land IQ company to generate this information. Are there any others in the area who are using Land IQ?
So TID is actually the first in our specific area. There are a few districts down south that have used Land IQ for a few years. In a lot of cases, that was kind of driven by they're in more critical overdraft as far as their groundwater table, we jumped on early because we said, we're not going to be driven into this. We're going to kind of try and be at the cutting edge of it. So one thing that's important to know is Land IQ it's very up to date. We're getting information from them all compiled basically daily of precip values, and then the crop types take about 6 weeks to get to us after they do that. There are open source versions of this as well. They're about 2 years behind. So we wanted something that was a little more up to date for decision-making processes, but this information is being used across the state and by the state as well to take a look at these sorts of things. So what the district's really looking at is we want to make certain that we have the most up-to-date and the most accurate information we can, because then we can protect our customers and make better decisions into the future.
Absolutely. Makes sense. Okay. And now I wanted to ask you about something called deformation surveying? I'm not even sure how to say it.
Yeah.
Okay. What is that, and what can you tell us about it?
So that's a pretty major land surveying project that we do every year. It's required under our FERC license for Don Pedro Dam. So one thing that people probably don't realize is that whenever you make a huge pile of dirt or in rocks, which is what Don Pedro is.
I.e. a dam.
It moves a little bit over time. And
it moves a little bit?
It does move a little bit. It's designed to move a little bit. So as your reservoir goes up and down, you're going to get a certain amount of deflection, basically a little bit of motion within that structure. And again, it's designed to do that. There's parameters under which that's all acceptable. But what we have to do is we go up every year and we basically monitor that motion. So we say, under these conditions, this is what everything looked like at the dam at this time. It takes about a week to do the whole process because it's very detailed. There's a lot of instrumentation that we use to do that. But there is a major component of it that is basically a land surveying project. You're measuring very accurately where all of these surface markers, which is basically just a monument set in the dam, how have those moved since last year? And then what we do is we take all that information, we send it to Evan Lucas, who's our dam safety engineer. He takes a look at all of it and says, yep, this is all exactly what I want to see. We submit the report to the federal agencies, and we're in compliance. So we've never had any issues in all the years we've been doing it.
That's good to know, because as somebody who lives in a community downstream of that dam, I'm hoping that that's one that we survey to a very small percentage and that you feel good about signing off on every year. All right. So obviously, all of these projects are super helpful to TID and help inform the decision-making that goes on here, as we've stated a number of times. Can you give us an example of something customer-facing as far as what a GIS project might look like?
So whenever any of our customers, maybe they come to a tour, they get a handout from the district, they go to a board meeting, and you see a map up on the screen. I would say the majority of those are put together by GIS staff.
Okay.
In some cases, they're just something that was put together for an individual presentation, so it was done by a certain staff member. But in most cases, it's a GIS product. What I'm going to say is the ones that look good, those are GIS products. If you don't like it, then it wasn't us.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, good. Well, and most of them in my experience have looked pretty good. So thank you for those. Now, something that the communications team specifically has been working on with your team is we created a district tour video where folks can actually watch the video and quote unquote tour different parts of our service territory, different facilities. We've been working with you guys on an interactive map to go along with that video. Tell our listeners a little bit more about that.
Right. So this is a product that it's called a story map is really what it is. And it's basically, if you have information that you want to present, and it may have a geospatial component to it as a location on the earth, you may want a map to show it, but you also want multimedia and you want narrative and all that sort of a thing. So it's basically on the far end will be a website that you can go to, or a component of our website, where you can run down through the story of the district, and you can see all of these portions of that video with the information of, well, where exactly is this? Are there any historical photos that you want to pull up? So it really makes for an interactive experience. And I think it's neat because it's something that whenever you do utility mapping, it's always kind of, to an extent, it's kind of boring. You're saying, here's where our facilities are for engineering purposes.
Sure.
This has actually allowed our staff to kind of move into something that's maybe a little bit more fun for the end user. It's a lot of work and a lot of coding for us to make all of that to work, but it's nice to be able to put something out where our customers can really jump into it and learn more about the district and interact with those tools.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really cool, and we appreciate your staff's help on that, because I think the end product, which is coming soon, is going to be a lot of fun for our customers to check out. Okay, so let's talk about some future projects. What can you tell us you're looking forward to? What sort of exciting projects are ahead of TID's future?
So one of the things that we want to do is we have a lot of different customer requests that come in. A lot of them are for new pole lines. I keep mentioning new pole lines, but that is a large part of the work done here at the district. Encroachment permits, basically anything that the customer submits as a project to the district. We want to create that in an electronic format that really models the whole workflow. So what will happen as a customer is you'll say, I have this request of the district. I get a request number back and a link that you can then track that request. So it'll show you who is working on it, at what stage they're on, and then since the workflow is modeled, it'll give you an idea of here's the target date for completion.
Oh, interesting.
So at any time, you can then log into our system and you can say, okay, I've got these 3 requests in. I can now see the status of each one. And if I have questions about it, I know who to contact. You don't have to call customer service and go through the phone tree and try and figure out, well, who's working on this component right now.
Okay, very cool.
So that's something that we want to get for both electric and water customer-facing requests. I think what that'll look like is over the next year, we're basically going to be piloting it and seeing how it works, kind of get some versions of it rolled out. And then shortly after that, you should see the initial rollout, which may just be a couple of the requests to start with. But over time, we're going to populate that with more.
Right on. Okay, great. What else is happening?
So I think the big thing is just providing more real-time information and data to our customers, both through a computer or in mobile formats as well. I really want to get to the stage that our customers can see a lot of the same information that we can, because I think it just helps communication so much when they're able to just see everything in a visual format on their mobile device as they stand out there. Because if something happens in the middle of the night, a customer's calling in, it's 2 a.m. and there's water on their property that they didn't realize was going to be there because of a pipeline break. It's just helpful for them to be able to see all of that information in one moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And then at that same time, you guys are having the same conversation. You're talking about with the same context of what's going on in that area, both in the district and as well as from the customer perspective.
Right.
Awesome. All right. So how do you see the surveying department evolving over the next few years?
So I think on the GIS side, I've mentioned it a few times, but really it's just increased reliance both internally and externally on the GIS. And really the form of that being as a data aggregator. So trying to get all that information in one place. For the surveying side, I'd say it's increasing the data availability, getting our old records digitized. So we have a lot of stuff that's in filing cabinets and storage boxes, and really getting that in electronic format, both to protect the records as well as make it more easily available. And then doing things like 3D modeling, using technologies like UAS. So when I talk about UAS, it's unmanned aerial system.
Unmanned aerial system. Okay.
Most people say drone.
Okay.
So really doing mapping using drones, or something like a LiDAR scanner. And what that is it's basically a unit that sits on the ground that collects millions of points per minute and gives you a very accurate 3D model of a space.
Wow.
It still is an emerging technology. It's been something that's, private firms may have used over the last 5 to 10 years. We kind of let things mature before we adopt them. So that's kind of where we're getting to now.
Okay, very good.
So really we're focused internally with a lot of this at this point, because we're we're really pursuing efficiency and cross-department communication. But the next step of all that will be to roll out a lot of this information to the customers as well. So another area of focus for us is in succession planning, and just the time period we're in right now. I think everybody's industry is this way, but we're having a lot of retirements. And so you have people that may have 20, 30, 40 years experience, and they're retiring, and then we get a new employee on. They need to be able to hit the ground running as quickly as they possibly can. So being able to standardize processes and provide this information in an easily digestible format just helps them do that. They get that knowledge of, oh, this is how this facility relates to this other facility, without having to wait for 15 years until they kind of just absorb it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we're kind of wrapping up our time together. Is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you wanted to make sure we mentioned during the podcast?
So giving me any opportunity to get on my soapbox, and I'll take it.
Oh boy, here we go.
So monument preservation is a big thing for the survey community in particular, but it's something that affects landowners. In a lot of cases, they're not really familiar with it. So a monument, a lot of people know them as property marker, property corner. If it's more modern, it's usually an iron pipe. So a 3/4 inch or 1 inch iron pipe, maybe 3 feet long, driven into the ground. It'll have a cap on it, and that cap will have a land surveyor's number in most cases.
Okay.
And that may be your property corner. There may be 4 of them, 5 of them, 6 of them, depending on what your property looks like. That's your property corner. Depending on how old it is, it might be a redwood post. It might be a car axle. It might be just a unique stone. And it's just whatever was said at the time. And they may be 100 years old, 150 years old in that location.
But
now,
these are literally things that are stuck in the ground in some manner or fashion that, like, I could see with my naked eye if I walked around our territory.
in most cases, you couldn't see them because they're buried.
Oh.
So they're actually located underground to protect them from people hitting them and that sort of a thing.
Okay.
So if you're aware of where they are, you can go and dig them up. But in most cases, people don't know where they are. When you buy your property in California, most of the time you don't hire a surveyor to go and show you where your corners are.
Sure.
You just say, well, there's the fence. That's the property line. What happens is the fences aren't always on the property line, and those corners don't always correlate with them. So one thing that occurs is people may put in a new fence, they might put in a utility, and those property corners get destroyed as they come in and do the work. What we notice is it kind of turns into a game of hot potato in a way. If you're the landowner that ends up having to do something where you have to find those property corners, it becomes very expensive if all of these corners have been destroyed for you. And the reason for that is to set your property corners on your particular property, it might take a surveyor going out and breaking down your entire subdivision or going 1.5 miles away to find available evidence to then go and put those property lines back. What it means is up front, if you'd brought a surveyor out and said, hey, can you tie out these monuments for me? Just make sure they're protected while I do this construction project. That might be, say, a $400 or $500 process, depending. I've actually seen other ones where property corners got destroyed and it ended up being tens of thousands of dollars for these people to put the monuments back in. So any opportunity I get, I always tell people, just be aware whenever you're doing a construction project anywhere close to a property boundary, it's in your best interest. Have a surveyor come out, private surveyor. They can take a look at it for you, find those monuments if they're there, tie them out for you. And you're protecting what's really your asset. When we go through and we do our work, we do the same thing. We make sure that we're protecting those monuments for the landowners and that we don't damage them. But it's always in your best interest, 1, to know where they are, and then 2, protect them as best you can.
Because like you said, these are most likely buried. And so myself as a landowner, I might not necessarily know exactly where these monuments are located, but in bringing a surveyor out to the property, they can identify where those are at.
Yeah, they'll be able to locate them for you and identify the actual monument. So I mentioned earlier, it may be a redwood post. You might just look at that as you're digging and say, oh, here's an old fence post corner, and not even think anything about it.
Sure.
But that represents a considerable value to you as a landowner.
Okay, so bottom line, construction on your property, call in a surveyor.
That's it.
Okay, very good. All right, Tristan, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate having you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the TID Water and Power Podcast. You can find TID on Facebook at facebook.com/TurlockID, on Instagram and Twitter at TurlockID, and on LinkedIn as the Turlock Irrigation District. I'm your host, Constance Anderson. We'll see you again next time.